But who is your harshest critic? You know, is it a friend? Is it a family member? Is it a coworker? Is it an old boss you used to have? My bet is that none of those are on the list. Natania's kind of giving me the physics, like right here. For most of us, not me, by the way, not me, right? But for me, I am, right? My harshest critic is me, right? I think for most of us, our harshest critic is ourselves. I mean, think about the things you think about yourself or say to yourself in your own mind. Would you take that from anyone else? You know, that we can get this kind of really difficult, dark narrative playing in our minds. That there's this kind of this self-condemning voice that can just kind of sit back there just waiting for your weakest moments. Just to tell you how badly you've done and why did you even try? You knew it was going to fail anyway. You know, that's something that we all struggle with. We all have that difficulty. You know, but it's kind of interesting, right, is that, but we don't walk around looking like it, right? As I see you guys this morning, I asked every one of you how you're doing. Everyone I had a chance to talk to. And what did every one of you say? It's great. I'm doing fine. You know, some folks have shared some personal things they were dealing with me, but almost every single person, I'm fine. Because we know we can't walk around like that all the time. And there's also the assumption no one actually cares. Just so you know, I do care if I ask you. I really do care. Yeah, I really do want to know. But the reality is that we've kind of learned, we've been conditioned to behave correctly in public. Right? We pretend like we're okay. We pretend like we're happy when we're not. You know, in fact, we come up with different ways like seeming like we're okay. Some of us pretend that we're happy. Some of us just get really big and just talk really loud and get real close to you, right? To make sure that you never really get close enough to me emotionally to know what I'm going on with. Others of us kind of get quiet and stay off to the side. And sometimes we hope that by acting that way, if we act like we're okay, we'll feel like we're okay. And there is some value that we do know if you smile, you tend to feel better. Right? But if you're struggling, pretending to be okay doesn't make you okay. Right? It's all just kind of camouflage. Right? And camouflage doesn't fix anything. And I think what most of us are hoping for is to actually feel better. And then it gets kind of worse, right? Because you may have this dialogue and this difficulty going on inside of you, and you look around at everyone else, and they seem fine. Because what are they doing? Same thing you're doing, right? We're all kind of putting on this mask to get along with one another, to not really expose ourselves. And again, you don't want to walk down the street kind of, letting it all hang out, so to speak, right? But we should be able to be honest with each other, particularly in this environment, right? We should be able to do that. But because we're always seeing our reality and comparing our internal reality with everyone else's external facade, we feel like we're the only ones dealing with it. We feel like we must be the only one that's broken, because as I look around, you guys are all happy. Everything looks good. Everyone's life is controlled, right? Everyone's money is perfectly managed, right? Everyone's relationships are perfect. All of our relationships with our parents and our children and our siblings, no problems there. But the reality is that we're all dealing with those things. But because we look around and we know our pain compared to other people's facades, we feel like we're the only ones. That we often feel so alone in those moments where that dark voice just gets a hold of us. And the thing that I want to say very directly, I think you know this, but it's good to hear. You are not the only one, right? That we all deal with it at least sometimes. Some of us deal with it a great deal of the time. And it's something that we're all struggling with. In fact, I am confident enough that enough of you here have this issue that I made that slide. Right? The weight we carry, self-doubt. Right? What I want to talk about or kick off this week is a series of messages where we talk about what is the weight that we're carrying. And I want to focus specifically on self-doubt today. We'll talk about some other issues as we go along. Right? Because we're all carrying some kind of weight. And if we're not careful, that weight, if we don't deal with it and we don't move past it, that weight can be crushing. Right? Because if we think about our journey through life, like if you think of life as actually traveling on a journey, and if you ever kind of been on a trip, like have you ever taken a long hike with a backpack that's too heavy? Right? A trip that could have been a very pleasant, enjoyable journey becomes a very arduous and painful journey. Well, life is the same way, right? If we go through life carrying a bunch of weight, our journey gets harder. We don't enjoy this very limited amount of time that we have on this life, right? A funny stat someone shared with me the other day. Do you know what the average lifespan for an American is? 81.3 years. Some of you guys are in trouble, right? 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 You know, I always joke about statistically, most Americans' lives, your high productivity years, we can kind of really do the things you want, end by the time you're 80, and I count those weeks until I'm 80. Next Saturday, I have exactly 1,000 left, right? And you start counting that out, you're just like, man, do I need to really deal with all this crap? You know, maybe I should get some help, right? Maybe I should. If you've ever seen the movie Devil's Advocate, and there's this line, put down that bag of bricks. You're carrying that bag of bricks, Kevin. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Put down that bag of bricks. We're all carrying a bag of bricks or a boulder, just consistent with my picture here. Right? And the thing is that these things just don't go away. Wanting to get better doesn't make us better. It's an important step. But there are things that we need to do to actually start to get better. You know, and we're going to talk about a bunch of practices and principles, you know, over these next few weeks. My hope is these are helpful to you. They've been helpful to me. But don't be afraid to get help, like professional help or, you know, supportive help to really help you get through those things. But there are some fundamental things that can at least move us in the right direction. And what I wanted to start with this morning was a single line from one of the Psalms, right? And the Psalms come from the Old Testament of the Bible, and they're basically a series of poems or a series of songs, and it's kind of, some of them are about praising God, some of them are about struggling with God, some of them are just kind of, you know, talking about the relationship with God. And I want to look at one line from Psalm 139. And Psalm 139 is attributed to King David. And so he's basically in the psalm, he's kind of talking to God or praising God and just saying how well God knows him and what God kind of, you know, wants for him and kind of what he wants to understand from God. And he makes this statement. He says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. God, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And so, like, what does that statement mean? You know, and I always like to remind us that the Bible was not written in English, right? It's translated from other languages. This is translated from ancient Hebrew, right? And anytime you do a language translation, the mapping is not perfect. You know, the word, something that might be one word in the original language may take more words in the target language. And so, like, this word here that's translated as fearfully, if you look at the Hebrew word, it actually means something worthy of honor, something worthy of awe, something worthy of respect. And so David is saying that I praise you, God, because you've made me that way. And you've made me wonderful. And he even goes on to say that the things you make are wonderful. So I want to ask you a question. When you got up this morning and you walked into the bathroom, you took that first look at yourself in the mirror in the morning, you go, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Was that your first thought about yourself this morning? It wasn't mine, you know, it wasn't mine. I have tried to condition myself to do that. I'm not as successful as I'd like to be. But there's something that Bonnie does with the kids sometimes. When they talk about this verse, one of the things that she has them do, she actually has some handouts to go with this. She'll actually ask the kids, who made you wonderful? The kids respond, God made me wonderful. Imagine if you woke up every morning and just looked at yourself, give your spouse a heads up that you're about to do it, sort of thing, right? But you look in the mirror and go, who made you wonderful? God made me wonderful. Because I think we forget that we are wonderful. I think that we forget that your existence is not an accident, right? No matter what the circumstances of your birth was, to God, you were never an accident. You were never unexpected. And he made you wonderful because the things that God makes are wonderful. And you're fearfully and wonderfully made. And so seriously, I used to have, years ago, I had little handouts I give people to stick on the mirror to say this to themselves. That it's so worth doing because it is important to be reminded of how God sees you because we struggle with how God sees us sometimes, or we struggle with how we see ourselves. And what I want you to hear is that God loves you exactly as you are. You may have things going on in your life that he would rather you weren't doing, that he wants better things for you than that. But nothing you can ever do will cause God to love you more than he loves you right now, because he loves you completely. Right? That we don't have to earn God's love. That love is freely given. We may have to learn to live in the fullness of it, to accept it, to fully experience it. But that love is always there. So remind yourself that you are wonderful. And God has a great plan for you. Now, as fun as it is to say, hey, you guys are good, just go out of here, say that every morning and you'll be all set. I wish I could tell you that. That's probably not going to be the case. Right? But it is a good foundation. It's a really good place to start. And so over these next 3 or 4 weeks as we go through this series, I would encourage you, for your own well-being, just as an experiment, just during the time of this series, every day, just start that. Like, make that commitment for the next 3 or 4 weeks to just start every day saying, in the mirror, who made you wonderful? God made me wonderful. Or if you want to do it as a couple, well, one of you ask the other one, who made you wonderful? God made me wonderful. It's important to do it for the other one as well, right? So no one feels alone, sort of thing, right? But to do that, just to kind of get into that mode, to recognize that God has a real purpose and plan and meaning for your life, even if you don't feel like it. And so as we get started in this series today, I want to talk about a guy who actually dealt with this kind of struggle, a guy named Gideon. Now, Gideon lived about 3,000 years ago. He's actually documented for us in the Old Testament book of Judges. And Gideon actually lived in a really, really challenging time. In fact, the period of what's called the Judges comes from the very early Old Testament. So if you look at the way the Old Testament is structured, you start out with the creation story, and then you get the story of Moses and the ancient Hebrews who were enslaved, and Moses leads them out of slavery, and then Joshua kind of takes over his lead, and Joshua takes them into the promised land, and then Joshua kind of leads them into kind of, setting up their homes in the promised land, and they have this kind of really kind of rich life in the promised land. But eventually Joshua dies. And the period of the Judges is the period that follows that. It goes on for about 300 or 400 years. And during that time, there is no real single leader. There's no political leader. There's no king. But there are these people who rise up who are called judges. They're kind of like protectors over the people. And Gideon is someone who rises up to become one of the judges. But when we meet Gideon, things aren't so good. That basically that their own nation is in such disorder that surrounding nations are basically sending in marauders and just kind of attack the people, kind of steal their food, burn their homes down, steal and kill their livestock. So these people who are living in the promised land of God centuries later are now struggling to survive. And they don't really know what to do with themselves. They're basically just barely surviving. And one of the things that's really relatable about Gideon is Gideon struggles with this idea of God. He asks the question I think that people often ask. If God is so good and God is so powerful, why is everything such a mess? Why is everything so broken? Because people keep telling me about all this stuff God can do, and I don't see it happening. And he really, really wrestles with that. Now, as we go through Gideon's narrative, we're going to take kind of a kind of an accelerated path through it. I'm going to kind of really focus mostly on the beginning of our encounter with him, and then kind of a little bit along the way after that. If you really want to see the full narrative, the core narrative is in Judges chapter 6 and 7. It actually extends out to chapter 8, but the core narrative is chapters 6 and 7. I'd really encourage you to give that a read, because we're going to focus on just kind of a few key parts of it here. But when we get to Gideon, we find him in a very kind of not ideal situation. When we first meet him, he is threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press. Now let's talk about what that means. So threshing wheat is this process of getting the edible portion from the wheat stalk, because most of a wheat stalk is not edible. Right? So what threshing wheat is a fancy name for taking a bunch of wheat and just hitting it against a rock. And that knocks off the edible portions of it that you can grab. Right? And then he's doing this at the bottom of a wine press. Now, you may hear wine press, and you're thinking of of Tuscany and this beautiful wooden structure and a beautiful press, and there's this cool little donkey walking around making things happen. That is not a wine press in that part of the world 3,000 years ago. A wine press at that time frame in that place is basically a hole carved into a rock with a flat spot at the top. And so what they would do is they would put the grapes up on the flat spot, and then you apply pressure, the juice comes out and does what? It rolls in the hole. That's a wine press. So what Gideon is literally doing, because he's so afraid of everything around him, that he is crouching in a hole with a little some stalk of wheat going, bang it against the rock, trying to eke out a little bit of food. That's what Gideon is doing when we meet him. And with that picture in your mind, let's jump into the story. So as he's doing that, he gets an unexpected visitor. It says that when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, the angel said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, do you think in that moment, Gideon sees himself as a mighty warrior? No, right? He's down in a hole, taking something that's a little bit different than grass, hitting it against a rock, trying to get some food out, and so afraid that he's crouching down, hoping no one sees him. And I think this is a really important visual for us. Gideon does not see himself as a mighty warrior, but God does. Right? God sees him as someone who's capable of great things. Just because Gideon is not doing great things right now does not mean he is not capable of great things. And it also shows us a really important difference between how we see ourselves and how God sees us. Right? We see ourselves in a very circumstantial manner. If our circumstances are good, I guess we're doing okay. If our circumstances are bad or difficult, then we tend not to feel as good about ourselves. But God is not circumstantial. God is constant. He knows who you are. He knows who he created you to be. He knows your abilities. He knows your inabilities. He knows your opportunities. He knows what you are capable of if you will follow the path he leads you on. If I will follow the path he leads me on. And he loves you completely. So he sees you as all that you can be, not necessarily who you feel like you are right now. And so Gideon gets this great greeting, right? The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And Gideon's just not having it. Like, if you read the text, it appears that he doesn't even hear the mighty warrior part. He kind of hears the Lord is with you, and he's like, are you kidding me? Because as the text continues, Gideon replies, pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? I mean, where are all of his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. And Midian's just the name of one of the nations that are mostly giving them a hard time. You know, and I think that this gets to that point of that question that many people ask. Now, I'm not saying you necessarily ask it here, but many people who struggle with faith in God. If God is so good and God is so powerful, and I hear all this cool stuff that Jesus did, have you looked around? Have you seen the mess that things are? If God is all those things, why is it like that? Because when things are difficult, we tend to focus on the difficult. When things are problematic, we focus on problems. We don't look for solutions. We get hung up in everything that's wrong, and we don't really kind of go beyond that. We just kind of get mad about it. We talk about it. We complain about it. We blame the other party or the other person or the other thing. And so Gideon hears all this and basically is saying, hey, God, why don't you do something? If you're this God I've heard about, why don't you do something? And it says, the Lord turned to Gideon and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? So Gideon's like, God, why don't you do something? And what did God say? I did. I created you. Use the abilities and the opportunities and the gifts that I've given you and follow that path. I've given you everything you need. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. But you need to decide to show up. You need to stop being on the sidelines. You got to stop being a commentator and be someone who acts and executes and is part of the solution as opposed to telling everyone else how they should be part of the solution. Develop the abilities you've been given and use them. Now, as you might expect, that is not the answer Gideon was looking for. Right? He wanted to hear that, he wanted to, fiery horse ride off into the distance, right, and take care of everything for him. So Gideon, kind of hearing that, says, pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? He starts making excuses now, right? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. Dude, you got the wrong guy, right? I'm a nobody from nowhere. I'm part of the smallest little clan. It's a tiny little family, and I'm just a little nothing in the middle of that. What are you expecting from me? And don't we do that ourselves? We see something, and maybe we can't solve the whole thing, but can we do something? Can we step into action in some way to make a difference? Because that's what Gideon is struggling with, right? He's doubting that he can make a difference. But as Gideon has this encounter, he begins on a journey that will truly transform his life. We're going to go through this kind of quickly, but he actually hears all this and he struggles to believe it. But what he does is, and it's something that's so important, is he stays connected to God. He keeps talking to God. Right? And that's what we want to do, right? That we want to keep talking with God. And remember that talking is a two-way conversation. Right? So what do? We should be praying, right? To keep our connection to God. Letting God know what we're worried about, what we're afraid of, what we think we can or can't do. But we also want to listen. Right? We read our Bibles or read a devotional, right? Make those things a regular part of your life. Stay in conversation with God. And if you read through the text, you will find that Gideon struggles a great deal with that idea of he's supposed to be the one to go do something. He even gets to a point where he's kind of starts testing God. Hey, God, if you really mean this, can you do this for me? Could you do that for me? And whether we agree that that's the right thing to do or not, I don't really think it is the right thing to do, but it works out okay for him. The key is, though, he is in connection. And he's developing his relationship with God. See, as we first meet Gideon, remember how he responded. Where's that God I heard so much about? In other words, when we first meet Gideon, God is this kind of far-off idea. It's something other people have told him about. But as Gideon kind of wrestles this out, and sometimes we do have to wrestle it out, as he wrestles it out with God, as he prays about things, he looks for indications, he looks for direction, his relationship with God begins to grow and becomes more concrete. And this God that was started out as just a far-off idea is now real to him and personal. And that's one of the things that's so important is that I haven't said this in a while, but I say it periodically. Sometimes I say it a whole lot. God is far less concerned with what you do than who you become. I'll say that again. God is far less concerned with what you do than who you become. Right? That we think that God is looking for us to kind of be that great warrior who shows up at the end, and if I don't achieve great things, then I haven't gotten anywhere. When the point is to become the person God has created you to be. But see, here's the paradox. God is far more concerned than who you become than what you do, but what you do influences who you become. And so it's in action that we really grow, that we really come to know God, that we really grow closer to God, that we really begin to embody what God is calling us into. And so for Gideon, he really wrestles this out because as he's starting to grow closer to God and starting to understand God's leading in his life more clearly, he starts realizing that God is calling him to do something that he feels incapable of doing, which is actually leading the defenses of his home nation. In other words, everything's a mess, and everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and because they're all the people of his nation are not working together, every time people get attacked, it's small little groups of people being attacked. And so Gideon is called to actually lead the people in his country to defend themselves. And Gideon doesn't feel like he can do that. And so he kind of keeps pushing back on, this can't really be me. Again, do you have the right guy here? But finally he accepts it. Because he has that ongoing, active connected relationship with God, He's willing to, again, wrestle it out, talk it through, and even step into things that seem really scary. He's willing to be bold. And finally, he steps out and accepts that calling to actually lead his people. And he's not even sure what's going to happen. So he finally puts out a call saying that, hey, I'll lead the effort if you guys will help me out. And then suddenly, thousands of men show up to help him in the effort. And he looks around and he sees all these people. And he starts to feel comfortable. Right? There are thousands here to help me. This is going to work out really well. But then something changes. God says to him that, hey, if you look around at all those thousands of people, when you guys go to battle and you win, you'll think you did this in your own power. So I want you to let a whole bunch of them go. I want you to trust me. That if I've led you into this, I will lead you through this. And so Gideon follows the directions. And he gives a bunch of guys a chance to go home. And it turns out, we learned very quickly, that the vast majority of people who had showed up weren't really ready for battle. That they were so afraid the first chance they had to turn and run, they did. So if he would have run into battle with them, it turns out they would have abandoned him in the middle of the fight. He also discovers that another group of people are actually not alert. They're not watchful. They would have not been safe to be in battle with, so they're gone. And so now Gideon finds himself initially looking at a crowd of thousands of men to just a few hundred. And God says, this is the right group for you. And I think it shows us a lot about our own lives, right? That if we feel like if we go where everyone else already is, that in that crowd we can be safe. If I follow that political movement, I'll be safe. I'll be like all the others in that movement. If I follow whatever other effort that's large, and I'll be with all them, and that's where the safety is. And it's not about being in the largest group. It's about being with the right group of people for you. Right? And so that's what happens for Gideon, right? Is that he gets into this right group of people who he can actually trust. People who believe that the same things are important that he does, people that he can work together with, who he can count on. Right? And is that not the local church? Right? That is why God built things this way. Right? Jesus calls us to be a church, serving our areas, to be with the group of people that we can work together with. Yeah, there you go. You guys got that? Yeah, sorry. To be with that group of people that we can work together with, to be unified in purpose. Right? I'm not saying that large churches are a bad thing. For some people, that's the right place. For others of us, it's a smaller church is the right place for us, because we're all meant to be working together in the way that we feel called together. And so for Gideon, because he's with this right group of people that he trusts, people who thinks the same things are important that he does, and they are one in purpose and one in mission. As Gideon leads out these men against the enemy, they successfully drive away a group of attackers that are far larger than themselves. And what we find here, and again, I really encourage you to read the details of the text, but what we find here is that Gideon, this man who started out hiding in a hole, beating some dried grass against a rock to try to get something to eat, becomes the leader of his people. He rises up to become a judge, the protector of his people. His life is changed. He's transformed. The people who followed him in the battle's lives are changed and transformed. And they cared for and they supported the rest of the people in their community. Right? That is what we are called to do as a church. Right? To support our community, to lift up those who are struggling, right? To point people towards Jesus, right? To work together, one in purpose, together. That's all of our journeys, and we are all being called to do that in different ways, but we're also all being called to do it together as one church. And that, if we can do that, if we can internalize that in our lives and collectively as a church, that starts to move us away from that ugly dialogue inside of us. Because what happens is that if we do the work we're called to do, we feel more connected. Or maybe another way to say it is less disconnected. Right? Because so much of that heavy dialogue in our heads that beats on us is when we're carved off and we're alone and we're just kind of in the darkness in our own mind. But when we're together in purpose, in direction, making a difference, making a tangible difference, that lifts us up. Not because we're trying to earn our way to wellness, but we are created to be purposeful and impactful. And what we find in Gideon's life is that his journey from hiding in a hole to leading his people is really built on kind of 4 fundamental things that he did. And as I wrap up, I want to touch on these really quickly. Right? 4 things that Gideon did. Right? Prayer, purpose, path, and people. Right? Prayer. You got to be connected to God. You got to make prayer a regular part of your life, but you've also got to hear from God. You've got to read your Bibles on a regular basis, or at least follow a devotional, anything from the Daily Bread to all kinds of other ones out there, right? But be in that connection to hear from God, because that's what leads us in our path to help us to see what we're being called to. Purpose. I mean, I've been beating this drum for 6 months now, right? Is that we are all called to a purpose, right? You were created on purpose with a purpose. That purpose is not to sit on the sidelines. It's to be part of making a difference, to reaching into people's lives and to be lifting each other up. The path, right? Start the journey and stay on it, right? We all have gifts. We all have abilities. Are we all investing in our gifts and abilities at the level we're capable of? Are we really doing the things we can do? Are we developing ourselves at the level that we can? Are we making the difference that we can? Right? And leaning into that. And this one is so important. People, right? Don't try to go it alone. Right? That we are created, particularly as followers of Jesus, we are created to be connected with one another, common in mission, to come together each week on a Sunday, as we do here, but also working together to make a difference in our community. And in that, we have connection. And when we connect most to people, is when we share life with them, right? When we do things together, we work together. It's in those connections that we are most enriched and most changed. My friends, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. But do we live lives that are consistent with how fearfully and wonderfully we are made? It's so easy to just step back and point out all the issues and never step in to make a difference. And I know that it is scary. And I know that we'd much rather hang back. But you're not going to silence that voice. You're not going to find satisfaction unless you step out and use the gifts you're given, develop them. And don't try to do it alone. Let's do it together and let's make that difference. Because that is the blessing of being part of the family of Jesus, to walk in that way.